We so enjoyed our first chat with Michael Nachbar, Executive Director of the Global Online Academy, or GOA, that we asked him to come back for a second interview. And just as before, Michael tackled our questions with vigor and showed an incredible depth of knowledge. As Executive Director of GOA, Michael spearheads a global network of schools and educators dedicated to transforming education. His expertise lies in integrating foundational teaching principles with cutting-edge technologies and innovative pedagogies. Michael's thought leadership is widely recognized and respected across the educational community. For his full bio, please see our show notes for this episode. We're curious about the concept of future-proofing education, so it made sense to consider Michael's take as a future-focused thinker. With that in mind, our guiding question was, what does online learning look like going forward, especially given the rapid growth of AI? Here are some of the topics we covered. How GOA is adapted to changes such as the COVID lockdown and the growth of the for-profit international school sector, as well as the ever-growing number of international schools. How some schools are preparing for the possibility of school closure, whether due to a worldwide or local event. The future of hybrid and full-time virtual learning. The process of getting buy-in from stakeholders for hybrid and full-time virtual learning. The unpacking of the term online learning, the efforts of the GOA staff to harness AI for their students, teachers, and partner schools, advice from author Daniel Pink on innovation in schools and his daughter Sophia's version of hybrid learning during her 10th grade year, generative AI in schools, and strategies to support teachers and students in growing their understanding of generative AI and how it can be used for teaching and learning. Michael reflected as well on his GOA Insights blog post, 7 Predictions for Education in 2024. He also addressed a few future-proofing strategies that schools can incorporate to be less reactive and more proactive, along with some guiding principles that can steer future-proofing. And finally, he talked about how GOA is working to future-proof its program offerings. This show was recorded on July 10th, 2024. Get ready for a clear look into the future with the intentional, insightful, thoughtful, knowledgeable Michael Nachbar.
Hello, Michael, and welcome back to the show for round 2. We are so psyched to pick your brain on big questions, moving from GOA outward to the whole world of the future of education. So let's start with, where in the world are you? I think you've moved north from Georgia.
I have north and west. So I am currently in Vancouver, British Columbia, where we, GOA, are hosting our Learning Summit. So we've got about 70 educators from around the world convening here to learn and work together.
All right, around the world. That's sounding like an opportunity for a going global story. Do you have one for us?
Yeah, I think a going global story is, the more global we get, it almost seems like the more the world seems to shrink. And that opportunity to make all of new connections and meet new people. So we're here on Vancouver's campus this week. We've never hosted here before. We're usually somewhere on the East Coast, or in Seattle we've done, and other cities. And who do I see on campus? Tim Carr, who used to be the head at Jakarta Intercultural School and who I've known for about a dozen years and met through GOA, because AISH, the Academy for International School Heads, is hosting their leadership conference here the same week. So it's fun to see friends that I usually only get to see at AAIE, but now here we are all together. So, the going global story, I think, is the more global we get, the more connections we make and people who join our lives. And that's something that I treasure.
Oh, that's delightful. I love it. You never intended to go global this week in that kind of a way, and yet it came to you. The world is at your doorstep. Oh, very cool. Well, Vancouver is a glorious destination as well. So I bet you're having your cup filled over there. It's awesome. So, since this is our second show, we're looking to the future in our crystal balls. And one concept that we're really interested in learning more about is the future proofing of education. So, with that in mind, our guiding question is, what does online learning look like going forward, especially given the rapid growth of AI? And we will go into some more granular questions on that, starting with, let's take GOA as a starting point. How has GOA adapted to changes such as COVID lockdown, ongoing geopolitical events that are closing schools left, right, and center, the growth of the for profit international school sector, which leads to the ever growing number of international schools? How is GOA pivoting and adapting to those current changes?
So many changes. It's funny to think about the way that we've adapted to what happened during COVID because we were really one of the groups that was helping schools navigate that and working with faculty and working with school leadership teams on thinking about the questions that they need to ask. But I like this question because I do think that we learned something. And I think we learned something that applies to how schools in general might adapt to future challenges as well. And we're still doing this, is listening to students and listening to what they need and what they want. And that's taught us a lot. So after COVID, we noticed that a lot of it coming out in student surveys, and then we heard more through student interviews, but more than ever, students were reporting to us that it was the synchronous connection time in their online classes that was something that they valued. I mean, numbers that were definitely different from previous semesters and years. And we saw that continue over the course of a couple of terms. Like that's one of the ways we just capture a lot of data and we look at it and think about what does this mean and how do we incorporate it into our program, our course design, the way that we facilitate. And so we've been able to adapt and make that pivot and build in more synchronous connection time with students and making sure that we're emphasizing students connecting with each other. It's led us to, we're right now piloting a new platform. It's a chat tool. We've had some in the past that were good, but we are piloting new ones that have features that let students do it in a more casual way. So really filling in some of those spaces in classes. So just again, being responsive and adaptive, listening to students and paying attention to what they need. They're great feedback givers.
Thank you for that. It does sound like you guys, and even from our last interview, are really responsive and you're great at getting student voice and choice into all your planning. Wondering if either geopolitical events causing school closures and or the growth of all international schools in general, particularly the for-profit schools, if either of those has affected the way you run GOA or not really, or
I think the for-profit sector, and especially in international schools, is super interesting. I think that mirrors in some ways the way we were talking about online learning in general last time, right? That when we say online, it means so many different things, right? I mean, online might mean adaptive software, online might mean content and videos, online might be what we talk about, right? Relationship based, um, passion based learning experiences. It can mean a lot of different things. And I think one of the things that I'm seeing, especially with the growth of for profits and international schools, especially, it's happening a little in the US, but we're seeing it mostly in the international space, mirrors that in that it means so many different things. It means, giant for profit companies managing schools to proprietary schools that are very local and run by, people in the community to small networks of schools that are pooling resources to, build campuses in different places. So it's been a question that we've been looking at for many years and not really being able to find an answer because it is changing and evolving so quickly. So I think for us, it's looking at that space, with the open mind that we ask people to think about online programs with, which is that they are definitely not all the same, and thinking about and looking at questions around mission alignment and the way that schools are working with their faculty and the kinds of programs that they're developing for their students are some of the questions you should be asking.
I really appreciate the buckets that you're describing there, the categories of different for-profit schools. And it makes me think, and I'm going to tell a quick story about HKIS. The instructional technologists, a long time ago, we were all out one night and we were talking about putting together our own virtual school, and we would brand it HKIS, which has a lot of cachet to it. And it was just a thought. This was after SARS and after we had virtual school. So I wonder if some of these kind of consortium of schools, the big dogs, are contemplating that as well, to somehow get their brand out there, to bring in more students, maybe totally virtual learning. Is that something you've picked up on at all?
I've seen that happen in a couple of places. I think that there was, in a few of those instances, I think the wrong question was being asked, right? I think that there were some schools that were thinking about how do we create a profit driver, which is something that independent and international schools, who for the most part are nonprofit, are not driven by. I mean, this kind of goes to the question we were talking about before, is what's driving it? And I think that if you are building something to drive revenue, the answers you're going to come up with are going to be very different from building something that's mission driven. And so that's probably where I've seen some of those initiatives go a little awry. And I think the other place is, and I still think this is true, people underestimate what it takes to do online really well. If you want to put content online and have people consume it, I mean, that's much easier. But when you look at whether or not that's mission aligned, the answer usually is no, it's not. And so if you try to do relationship based, experiential, and I'd say experiential in an online space, right? Kids learning by doing, which can be project based, right? Inquiry driven. It takes a lot of support. And I think that's where a lot of schools underestimate just what that lift is. I think that's one of I know we're expanding beyond GOA, but I do think we're a case study in how to do that correctly, which was that the schools that formed GOA at the beginning invested in its infrastructure right away, right? We launched off as an independent nonprofit, not as a department within a single school. We had a team working on this outside. It's what Michael Horn and Clayton Christensen wrote about in Disrupting Class. It was written about in Elevate or Accelerate, right? It's creating that side group that can innovate and work independently, that lab school, the R&D center, that skunk works and can think autonomously without the constraints. But again, I think for a lot of those programs, the constraint is something other than designing a mission focused organization. It's creating revenue. And those, I think, can be competing desires.
You're really helping me understand in the way you're showing the two sides, the two pathways. Because I was going to say, I wonder if they're doing it for profit, more of a revenue stream. And so you're answering my question, and what I was thinking was the case. All right, well, let's move on to lessons learned. So this is kind of moving us forward a little bit in your interaction with schools that you worked with and maybe schools that you heard. What have they been doing since the lockdown, since they went fully online to prepare for the future? And I want to share another quick little HKIS story. And my story was after we did virtual school for the SARS shutdown and we went fully online, The following year, we began to have a weekly practice session of virtual school. The kids were still in school, but the teachers really leveraged the LMS, whatever the other tools were. And like you were saying earlier, one of our biggest takeaways, just like you said, was connections and community. So, how could we use those tools that when the kids would go home and they would be able to connect to each other and get the practice of if they were not able to go to school the following week, if something terrible happened, they would be ready. So, what are some lessons learned that you've picked up that schools are doing to prepare for the next closure? And I'll add, it doesn't need to be a worldwide closure because back to what Audrey was saying earlier, there can be a city, a section of a city, a part of a country that closes a school down due to a weather event or unrest, civil unrest. There are a lot of possibilities.
Yeah. I mean, on a very pragmatic level, we're seeing schools leaning more into their learning management systems, right? How are they utilizing them? What are the policies and practices that schools want their teachers adhering to when it comes to how they leverage LMSs, right? What goes online and what doesn't? And I think the bigger trend that we're seeing with this is I think there's been a shift in how schools are leaning into professional development. And we've been seeing this trend evolving over the past few years, but it feels much more widespread now than it ever has before. And that trend is a move away from kind of the laissez-faire, choose your own adventure, teacher professional development to school-driven professional development, right? So thinking about the school driving what their goals and aims are and providing professional development to their faculty within that scope of what it is that they're trying to achieve. And that feels different to me than what we've seen in the past. I've heard of schools reallocating their professional development budgets from individual teachers to bringing in instructional coaches, right? So they'll have an instructional coach. They're absorbing what's happening outside and what the themes are and how that aligns to the mission and maybe even the strategic plan. And they're interpreting it and then they're bringing it to faculty meetings and working with teachers on campus, which is different than what we've seen in the past and feels exciting to me because I think related to that is schools defining educator competencies within their institution, right? So what does it mean to be a great teacher at this school as it pertains to our mission and the work that we're engaging in? What are the competencies and habits of mind that we want our teachers to possess and learn and grow in while they're here? And then how do we offer them professional development opportunities to grow in those skill areas? And I think that's still somewhat nascent, but I think we're going to see a lot more of that given the shift in how schools are approaching professional development.
So, if I can just ask for a little bit of clarification, please. I do like the idea of things being individualized for particular schools, their mission and values, and so on. Please help me understand, because David and I have talked about back in the day, because we've been doing this so long, there was sort of more of a one size fits all where the outside consultant would come in and everyone would sit in, the gym or wherever, and you'd sit and get kind of thing. I'm imagining that what you're talking about isn't like that, perhaps is still somewhat individualized. Maybe you can help me see a little more clearly how that works so that I'm not thinking, oh no, we're going back to sit and get.
Yeah, I don't think it's sit and get. I think there might be schools who could bring in an outside speaker, an outside group. So take us, for example, right? We will come in and one of the things that we pride ourselves on is really bridging theory and practice. So not coming into a school and dropping theory bombs and then leaving and say, what do you think of that? Right? No, it's guiding people through what does this mean for you and how might you apply it and leaving with a plan. But when we leave, we're also providing resources to a point person who is usually an instructional leader on campus An instructional leader can be a lot of different roles. I mean, it could be a dean of faculty, it could be a director of teaching and learning, it could be department heads. I think the way that schools are defining instructional leadership is pretty varied, but they're doing it. And I think that's the key. And so when we leave, those instructional leaders are tasked with moving this work forward with their faculty, right? It's not left up to everyone to figure out on their own and kind of, let's hope, right? That was really exciting. And then, nobody is talking about it again. No, now you have people who are, they brought that group in or that person in because it aligns, the work that they're doing aligns with the work that that school wants to grow in. And now they can continue to, create PLCs or, development plans for individual teachers, or maybe they're working with a group of faculty instructional leaders who are going to show and create, maybe like I've seen this in schools. Like that was great, right? We had somebody come in, we learned about this. Now we're going to pull together a group of 8 or 9 teachers, and they're going to really move this forward to show us what this can look like here. And then they're going to work with the faculty for the rest of the year or next year even, right? Like we have a plan. We're being deliberate and we're being intentional about the way that we want to grow our faculty. That's something we talked about last time. And I think that's still a big theme, just with our students, but also with faculty growth.
Thanks for clarifying. That sounds like a fantastic model.
Yes, and that is one of our big themes, personalizing learning for educators, not just students. So, what I can see is, again, a dual pathway, one for school-wide initiatives and things that are going to support the mission. And what you're adding in there is we're getting much better at providing the follow-through, the boots on the ground, and supporting leadership and hopefully some accountability, right? Because take virtual learning, for example. Guess what? We've got to do it well, and you can't kind of hide in your room when we go virtual. So if we're going to do this, we're going to bring in Michael's team. Everyone's going to follow through, and we're going to see some practice and such. And then the other side is that individual area, like it could be, like you're saying, competencies that teachers choose specific ones. And then they personalize it. They put together where they're listening to podcasts, reading books, working with an instructional coach. They put their learning plan together. So I think that's a definite way to go forward. So let's keep moving in the forward direction. And I want to share another story. I'm becoming a storyteller, I guess. So over 10 years ago, I worked at Washington International School in Washington, D.C., and we had a father and a daughter who were very interesting. The father, Daniel Pink, who people might know as a well-known author, and his daughter, Sophia, I didn't know her until I interviewed her, but was in high school where for her 10th grade year, she put together a full hybrid to virtual learning program where she didn't come to school. She took online classes, and I think she worked with some of the agencies, maybe some of the museums, but she developed her individualized learning plan for the year. And there was an article in the Washington Post about her, and I did a podcast, 2 interviews with her, so we'll have that in the show notes. So there we're talking about students, and I'm going to get to my question. And the other part was Daniel Pink came to the school and gave us a talk. We were an IB school, and we were trying some cutting edge pedagogy, did a lot of work with Project Zero. And one of the things he said was that all sounds very exciting, but remember, your parents probably have a lot of degrees. They experienced education with the kind of the standard pedagogy of direct instruction, maybe a lot of lectures. So he kind of warned us. He said, when you're trying to bring parents on board for new approaches to teaching and learning, just be careful how you present it, because they know what worked for them. And they might be thinking that's what we want for our children. So with this preface, my question is, what might future hybrid and full-time virtual learning driven by personalization look like? So that's kind of the big question, but how do we get students and teachers and parents to buy into either of these approaches as we go forward?
There are lots of layers to that question. Again, I mean, we talked about this last time, and I don't want to, keep kicking the horse, but it's something that I think has to continually be said, which is when we are talking about virtual learning, we are talking about a lot of different things, right? So, what is it that we're talking about? I think we might even be able to put that on hold for a minute, right? And look at the rise over time in online learning. And let's trickle it down from universities and colleges. So 12 years ago, 1 in 5 students in college took an online course. That has continually been growing at a constant pace. During COVID, the line before COVID, it was about 35%. Then during COVID, it jumped to like 70%. And then after COVID, it picked up again and the slope continued exactly where it had left off pre COVID. We're at 50% now. So half of the students in college and universities will take an online course. In K 12, it's like 4%. And that's been consistent over time. And so I think asking that question of why is important and how do we personalize for students, I think comes out of that too, which is, I think for a lot of K-12, I'm even going to, let's move the slider up and look at just high school, because I think when we're talking about virtual learning, I mean, I know that I wouldn't want my elementary students in a virtual school. And I think just what we know about development and relationships and all of that, we can kind of focus on upper middle and high school. But I think that the opportunities in colleges and universities is about, I mean, for them, I think part of it is cost, but also I think part of it is just options, right? You can offer more by partnering or bringing in professors who might not be on campus or whatever it is. It can also, I mean, another driver can be scheduling, to have that free floating period or class in a schedule that doesn't need to be tied to a classroom is huge. So there's so many ways to kind of approach this. But I think for high schools, the question really needs to be about just student choice and options. Students they're so curious. I mean, this is when. And for a lot of schools, if you are not able to bring in faculty or, expand your campus or what have you, in leaning into online education or virtual learning can do a lot of wonderful things that perhaps you wouldn't be able to do in a traditional way. So I think it's just about options. I think it's about flexibility. And I think it's about, again, intentionally offering students things that they might be interested in.
Well, during the first interview, design was a theme that ran through our chat with you. So, what I'm hearing again is how are we designing, in this case, our time, our schedules? Like, for example, you just dropped the idea that maybe you build in a flex time, and that's when a lot of students can be any place on campus and taking that class from GOA, for example. And another thing I'm hearing you say is we really need to do a good job at letting students know their options. That if a school is connected to a network of online providers, they can help students do that. And I'm going to bring it back to Daniel Pink. Let the parents know that one of our goals is to help students learn how to learn, right? That's one of our most basic goals there is. And this is how they're going to learn in the work world going forward, most probably. It's going to be some type of online learning, some hybrid situation. So that makes a lot of sense.
David, I think what you're touching on is the parent education piece is huge. I know later we'll talk about some of my prediction posts that I've done over the years. And one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about recently is the role of parent education in allowing schools to innovate and do things differently. And I think it's one of the pieces that's been missing, which is, and I think that story you told is exactly right. If schools don't start talking to parents and guardians about the school that they want to be and why, and teaching the parents and guardians, who in many ways are also the customer, right? Teaching them how the school wants and intends to change over time and why that's great for their students and what that's going to look like, et cetera. If they don't do that, then I actually don't think that schools will be able to evolve as quickly or implement a lot of the changes that they're hoping to. We've got to educate families. They're curious also. I think coming out of COVID, they all had a front row seat to their students' education. And let's not underestimate them. I know that there's kind of in education, there's just because you went to school doesn't make you a teacher. And I think that's true. Teachers are professionals, but it also doesn't mean that they're not discerning customers. I want to use that in like air quotes, the idea of parents as customers. I hear it, and that's my little disclaimer. But in this sense, I think we do need to think of them in that way. And schools are going to need to be much more deliberate about educating families about the kinds of education that they want to do. Otherwise, I don't think that we're going to be able to change what we're doing, because families will feel left out of that process. And we don't want that. So I think it's an opportunity for schools to lean into for sure. And I think it's a trend and a prediction that we're going to see much, much more of in the years to come.
And that was the topic from our first interview on how international schools can be the hub. And we know through the parent organizations and different parent groups who come in on the weekends, there's a real opportunity to listen. Like you were saying, let's listen to what the students have to say. Well, let's find out from the parents. And then in helping them understand, here's where we're going. You're telling us these are your values. Here's what you want for your children. Well, here's how we're going to get there. And it's going to involve some changes in maybe the way you went through your educational experience. And then, of course, to jump back to the US, we've just gone through tough times, and they're continuing with parents really questioning what's going on in some of the classrooms, kind of bringing their agendas at times. And so my response, instead of being reactive and defensive, is do what you're saying, is to get positive and say, just what I'm saying, what are your values? What do you want for your kids? Let's find that pathway. Let us help you better understand why we're doing what we do.
Absolutely. And your values align with our values. It's why you chose us. And in, independent and international schools, it's why we chose you too, right? We matched together. And this is what that meant. And this is what it means. And this is what it will mean and look like going forward. Yes, I totally agree with you.
So they're with you for the ride now. I love that. So popping into a slightly different direction, we did touch on this last time. We'd like to really dive in. AI is a theme in your articles and in your GOA courses. So we'd love to have you describe the efforts of GOA and the staff to harness AI for your students, teachers, and partner schools.
AI. It's a really interesting time right now in education. I think AI is one of those tools. It almost feels like this is the steam engine in education, right? It feels that pivotal, and that feels really exciting. So, at GOA, we've been working with schools to think about not just the questions that they should be asking, but also working with faculty and schools on how to actually do this. And what's also interesting is that we're seeing a lot of schools, and this sounds kind of elementary, but I think there's a perception that everybody is talking about and looking at this, and that's not really true. There are still a lot of schools out there that have not begun the conversation around AI, or they have people, in the school who haven't touched AI or used it yet. They keep meaning to, but they haven't. And so we're looking at schools, you're either in one of those camps, right? You're at that beginning stage of where do I begin? And what are some of the questions I should be asking? And then you have other schools looking at, okay, how do we do this? And what is this going to look like? And so we're working a lot with schools on thinking about, that implementation, both curricularly, programmatically, and operationally. And we see it on both sides. And that's a lot of how we are thinking about it. So when we're working with a school, we're working with a school very often at reflecting the way that we've done it. And I think that's something that schools have come to count on GOA for, is that we do function as that lab school. So moving pretty quickly with a faculty that is curious and innovative and a team that can do that. Because again, right, we talked about last time, we don't have a lot of the constraints that a physical school has. We don't need to deal with schedules and campuses and parents and guardians and drop off and all of those things that make the day. We get to talk about teaching and learning and pedagogy and how we're going to implement these into our classes. So I'm going to break it out into the operational side and then the programmatic side. And then I think within that, you have AI as a tool and AI almost as a feature, right? It's something that you're using versus it's something that's happening in the background. So operationally, we are using AI to look at data, and I think schools can do that too. We're using AI to look at student engagement data and provide reports in a way that we do it already pretty fast because we collect so much data. But using AI is just speeding all of that up. So, analyzing student feedback, looking at trends within teacher classrooms. And I mean, there's just so many ways that we are using it. And then, AI as a feature, one of the things that we're looking at is how can we capture student work and feature it back to, a site, like we have a point person at schools. You can even think of this as like students and parents and guardians. But we've been playing with this and it's really good at it. Like at the end of a week or a 2-week period, going through student discussions and student work that they've handed in and creating customized reports for that student on the work that they did over the 2-week period. And we can provide it back to schools, but you could provide that back to families. I mean, to ask a teacher to do that, you couldn't, right? And then curricularly and programmatically looking at AI as, one of the simplest ways that we're using it is as a curricular tool, just in curriculum design and thought partner. And then as a feature, using it as a tool in the classes, using it as something that kids can engage with. So for example, I like photography and I've volunteered to help redesign the digital photography class. So one of the competencies that we want students to be practicing is how to give and get feedback through critiques. So you need to teach them how to do this. They need to experience it and they need to practice it. So one of the things that we are building is a bot in the class that at the beginning, students can submit a photo to, get a critique feedback and start learning the language. And then they can practice it and get feedback on their critique from the bot in a way that the teacher just wouldn't be able to do as many times. And then, by week 3 or 4, they can start doing this with each other, but they've already practiced it now a few times. So thinking about just things like that, right? Can we practically build in some of these tools into classes? But then also, how are we using these tools to support the work of teachers?
I love the idea of leveraging the capacity of a bot to provide that one-on-one, just-in-time feedback that, yeah, like you said, is just not possible for a teacher to be everywhere all at once. That's brilliant. So it sounds like you have some great specific strategies that you've already been implementing at GOA because you guys are really on the bleeding edge of things, which I just so admire and appreciate. What if there's a school that's sort of, like you said, there are some that really haven't addressed this or just starting out? Do you have some advice for those folks?
This sounds overly simple, but you just have to use it. Just use it. Use it for something. But you've got to go to the site. You've got to pick one of the tools and just start using it for anything. Again, I feel like that sounds overly simple, but for me, that's the starting point. This is going to sound like a shameless plug, but we do have a course that's open to everyone called AI Essentials for Educators. And it's just a getting started course and it's free for everybody. This is one of the ways that we're just giving back and supporting the educational community. And it's got a lot of resources, some really good guiding questions, and there's a great place for people to start. it'll get you started. So if my advice of just use it feels overwhelming, getting into a course like that will provide you with a couple of starting point tools, right? Like, what is the URL to actually go to? We'll take you there. And then we'll help you start to think about ways that you can use this and with questions that you should be asking. Because I think that this goes both ways, right? I mean, we're thinking about it in a few different layers, right? On the student layer, how are students using it and what does that mean? We're thinking about it on the teacher level of how are they using it? What does that mean? But on the administrator level, they've got to be asking the questions, because if they're not asking the questions about what does this mean, then there's not going to be a driver for faculty to use it. And then the faculty who are using it will bump into that wall of, I'm going way too fast here, and people are afraid that I'm breaking things. And so it is, I think, important for administrators to start understanding, like, what should we be asking? What should we be expecting? How are we going to be driving this? That's going to be essential. So use it.
One thing that comes to mind is, especially with all the kind of middle leadership growth that schools are trying to do, is to go out to your staff and say, who would like to go out and learn more about AI curricularly, operationally, and then go to your back office staff and say, who would like to do these? Because we would like to empower you. And then you come back and do a teacher teaching teachers, whether you have to go off campus or you go take your course or whatever it might be. And I really appreciate that focus on the leadership and the questions, just coming up with those questions and then trying to build some kind of framework. So what is learning? So much of learning is putting things in some type of organization that we can study. Connectivism, connectivism theory. So that makes total sense. Thank you for that.
Yeah, I love that. You did make me think. I mean, the other group to also ask about this, what a great opportunity to ask students and engage students in what they think. They're so often left out of these conversations about what they want. I mean, this kind of also goes back to some of what we were talking about before. What do they want? What kinds of courses would they want to take? But specifically regarding AI, how are you using it? And how do you think you could be using it? And this is a great chance to do that. Put together an ad hoc student committee, ask your students to use it for a few weeks. And we've seen a few schools do this, and the results were amazing. They let kids use it. They were like, use it for everything. And then they pulled them back together and they said, now what? How did you use it? What policies should we have in place? Like, did you cheat with it? I think we'd be surprised. I know we would be, because we've heard that from schools. I think there's a lot of schools getting stuck on the cheating. Some kids have always cheated, right? We've always had this. There are a lot of kids, they didn't cheat. And just because they have access to this doesn't mean they will. So we can put that to the side and really engage them in some higher level thinking about the possibilities that they see for these tools. And we need to also unlock, like my daughter, who's 16, she will not use AI. And I keep saying, can I sit down and show you? She said, no, it's cheating. That's not my work. I said, you don't understand what it can do. Let me show you. She's like, no, it's cheating. And so we need to move the conversation beyond that, because, obviously it's not going away and it's just getting more and more sophisticated.
A key word there is policy. And I was wondering about students, how to bring them on board. And like the old days, I guess still we do it now. The technology use policies used to be handed down from above, but then schools realized, let's go out to the students and talk about how they use technology and what should be the best ways to use it and what should be the ways we don't. And then you write it together. So it's the same thing you're saying right here. And I think the students can come up with kind of a code of conduct. How do we leverage this that supports what we believe in? And how do we handle it if people are not using it very well? So there are a lot of different, again, project-based learning, real life students figuring these things out, problem solving. So that's pretty awesome.
Yeah.
All right. So we continue to put you on the spot, and we're not going to stop, Michael. So we're going to jump to your article, which I highlighted in our Facebook group, 7 predictions for education in 2024. So I'm wondering, now that we're in July, which of your predictions do you feel really have legs going forward?
It's funny. I've been thinking about some of these posts, and I realize that very often I need to take a different stance in what my time frame on these is. So I'm going to start saying these aren't predictions for next year. These are predictions for the next like 7 years. So obviously, I think it was a softball one to have the expanding role of AI in transforming education. It feels like a duh one. The one that I have on here that I think we do keep kind of coming back to in some way is that the fluid, adaptive, and responsive schedules. I mean, this is one that we've been talking about for a decade, and is one that post COVID, I thought schools would be leaning into more. I still stand by this. I think this is going to come. I think this is the keystone in rethinking a lot of what we do in schools, is thinking about how we leverage time and place. I think it's key to how we support teachers. I think it's key to creating opportunities for teachers to think differently about their own schedules and therefore teacher wellness and well-being. I think it's key for giving students options. And it's also still very exciting to me, right? What could the school year look like if we were to rethink the way that we look at time and place? What does that look like around facilities use? What does it look like for teacher schedules and student schedules? And so I kind of do keep putting this on here. Part of it is, if I wish real hard, I think we can move the needle on this. But I still think schools will recognize this. Like, we'll not be able to make a lot of changes that we want unless we make that change, which is going to require supporting teachers, teaching them how to create asynchronous learning opportunities, understanding that just because you're not together doesn't mean that you can't collaborate. So we can have discussions in class, but we can also have a discussion that takes 3 days. Those are different. They're not replacing each other. They're complementing each other. Anyway, I'm ranting a little. I'll stop. But I think the fluid, adaptive, responsive scheduling is pretty important. So I'm going to double down on that one. I'm curious which ones you think have legs.
So, Michael, the civic discourse and the experiential learning are a couple that really jumped out at me as a guy that did an outward bound semester when I was in college. And that's probably when people think experiential education, that's what they think of. But there are many other forms of experiential education, just like you were saying. And this is what blows me away about your program, that you're able to take things from the analog world and bring them into the digital world and then back into the kids' lives wherever they are. So there are many opportunities for experiential learning. And as a counselor, I also call that just life learning, because so many of our young kids and high schoolers don't have a lot of life experiences. So the more that we can do that, the better. And of course, on the civic side, with what's happening in the US of A, but it's around the world in certain, we're watching different elections and such. But I'm totally in agreement on the fluidity of the schedule and how we can, and you're right, we've been talking about it forever, reinvent how we do schools. This goes back to Gates and his statement that American high schools 25 years ago just weren't doing what we want them to do, and we can do a lot better. So I'm in agreement with you.
Yeah. I mean, I agree. The experiential education, that means a lot to me. And I even see GOA as being an experiential education environment, right? I mean, at the most basic level, it's learning by doing. But the definition that I have in that post from the Association for Experiential Education is that experiential education is purposefully engaging learners in direct experience and focused reflection in order to increase knowledge, develop skills, clarify values, and develop people's capacity to contribute to their communities. You're right. You don't need to be in the woods. You can do that in the classroom. And I even will go out and say, I think you can do that online. Being online isn't where the learning happens. The learning happens when the online experience pushes students to engage in their communities, right? So that digital photography class, like one of the things that I'm thinking about is how do I get students to engage in their communities, right? To document the stories in their lives, to share with others and reflect on those experiences by engaging with people on their block and in their communities and in their schools. That's experiential learning. The learning's not happening online. That's why if we keep defining, and I think it's the default definition of online learning, is that it's about watching videos or listening to lectures or absorbing content. No, that's not experiential learning. That's very traditional. But if we take the things that a lot of our schools value and espouse around their philosophies of learning, those foundational principles of getting kids using what they're learning or applying it, then that can happen anywhere. And that feels very exciting. And then I agree with you, the civic discourse this year, especially, I think that's something. How do we listen? How do we see people? How do we connect and engage? That's going to be really important too.
With your experiential learning, you're reminding me of a friend of mine who's working with kids who haven't been able to go to school for a variety of reasons. Maybe they were taking care of a sick parent, maybe they had to work, maybe they had younger siblings they had to look after, and so on. And my friend is helping them look at what they have as their experiences and parlay that into a
GED or general education diploma.
and it sounds like you're talking about is turning that the other way around and proactively creating these experiences where they can meet the objectives and things through what they're doing outside the classroom. That's fantastic. So what other future proofing strategies can you think of that schools can incorporate so they're less reactive and more proactive? Maybe some guiding principles that can steer the future proofing.
I'm going to go back to something that I shared earlier. Again, I think all of this, just bringing it back to being deliberate and intentional. I think one of the ways schools will be able to future proof is by being deliberate and intentional. And I think it's going to require being clear about what great teaching and learning looks like at their school. I think, again, going back to those educator competencies, what does it mean to grow as a professional educator in your school? What does that look like? And what practices are consistent from class to class and grade to grade that where anybody who comes to visit will see, right? Not just, your 2 or 3 star teachers, whatever that means. And I think that in order to do that, schools are going to need to really drive professional development at their schools. So driving it in a way that it's aligned to those competencies and then thinking about how they're going to measure that over time. I mean, I imagine a moment where schools, when they're interviewing teachers, where they can say, great teachers at our school do these things. They have these skills. And as an educator here, we will make sure that you continue to grow in those areas. And those will be different for different schools, just like student competencies are different for different schools, right? When we look at a portrait of a graduate, what does a portrait of an educator look like? And how do you ensure that all of your faculty, right? They're not walking across the stage, but that same idea, right? When they walk across the stage, what do they all have in common? I think schools that do that will for sure future proof themselves so that they're not being reactive and they're being proactive.
All right, so we're finishing up here, and let's bring it back to GOA. So, drawing from what you've just shared, what are some examples of what GOA is doing to provide some degree of future proofing of your programs? And you've answered this question in multiple ways. But as we finish this second interview, which again, I'm just so enjoying what you're sharing with us and our audience, let's kind of tie it all together. As GOA is going forward, what are some principles in place? And of course, you're being deliberate, intentional. That's a part of who you are. And you're designers. That's another thing that comes up. What else is helping you plan for the future?
I mean, first, we're going to keep putting students first. I think that's always been something that we've done, and it's something that we'll continue to do, is putting students first and caring deeply about them, caring about their experience, caring about how they're growing, but just working with teachers who also care about them as people and creating a sense of belonging in our student classes. And we also bring that ethos to our professional learning, is caring about our faculty as learners too, and caring about schools, and that we can keep growing and evolving. That feels really exciting. So I'm going to say we're going to keep caring. We're going to keep on being optimistic about the possibilities that the future holds for education. This is a really exciting time in education. It just feels kinetic in a way, and we're inspired by that. And with that, I think we're going to keep on pushing and keep on asking the question, what if, right? What if we did this, and how can we be better, and how, right? And so just kind of leaning into the possibilities and being on that edge is a place that we want to be and stay.
What really inspires me about GOA and how you do things is the way you're always looking at your stakeholders in terms of students and teachers and getting their voices in there, and how you can lean into this idea of collaboratively, constructively looking at your programs and really examining what you're trying to accomplish and getting all these voices in so that you do it the best it can be done for all the stakeholders. I just really, really admire that about your program. So we said this last time, but maybe you can just repeat for us quickly how our listeners can follow you if they want to hear more about GOA, future-proofing schools, and all of your incredible ideas.
The best way to dive into our work is to go to our website, globalonlineacademy.org. You'll see overviews of all of our programs, but the place that we are pretty prolific in writing is on our blog, which is on that site, and it's under the Insights tab. And you will be able to geek out to your heart's content on all things learning. It's a good resource. My amazing team contributes to it weekly, and it's ever growing.
Fabulous. And really, I feel so blessed to have come across your organization through Becky Green. Little shout out to Becky. And we are so inspired by you and really want to keep this relationship going. Hopefully, we can get you back on at least one more time to talk about some more of these fabulous innovations that you do on an ongoing basis. And we really want to thank you so much for taking time, especially you're at a conference. It's 6 a.m. for you. Well, it's almost 7 a.m. now, but so appreciate your time, Michael. Thank you.
Thank you. I have loved these conversations, and I would love to have another one. Just tell me when and where, and I'll be there.
Yay, yay. Well, Michael, we will pull you back in and we will learn together. So thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. It's Audrey.
And David.
We're so happy and grateful that you're here listening to us. We really want to thank the people who follow us on Apple Podcasts and have written reviews. We appreciate you guys.
We hope to increase our reach within the international education community, so we are asking for your help. Please follow our show on Apple, Spotify, YouTube Music, or your favorite podcast listening app. We have posted instructions on how to do this on our podcast page.
If you like our show and the services we aim to provide, please rate us and write a review. This will help us grow our audience and support our mission of sharing the joys of international teaching with as broad a group as possible. We'd love to increase those numbers in Africa, South America, and Australia.
So thanks again for listening and for all your support. Let's recruit as many teaching peeps as possible to travel,
Teach,
and connect with us.